Welcome to I Wish I Knew, a DisruptED TV podcast. Today, we're talking with Pam Moran from Virginia. As you know, this is a show where educators share a time when they jumped into something and wish there was one thing they could have known that would have helped out. Pam, what story do you want to share with us today?
Chris, first I'm going to just say how much I appreciate being on the show with you today. And it's been a delight to chat with you a little bit ahead of time and just talk about what it's like for us to be in this place where we feel like that we've put an entire lifetime into a career. And I kind of sense that you're like me. I've got a great, wonderful family, but I also think about my education work, my career in education, as being like almost another family member. Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, when I think about what I wish I knew, I think that one of the things that I think about, I go back to is, that I've been reflecting a lot on leadership and doing some writing. I blog it on a Medium blog, and really thinking about what is it that from my observations over time that defines the best of leadership. And I define leadership probably differently than what maybe occurs in most people's minds, because I've seen 5-year-olds who have been great leaders in a school. I've seen teachers, obviously, teenagers, parents, at building level administrators, central office leaders. And one of the things I think I've learned over time, and I really am thinking that I wish I had known this a lot earlier in my career, that we tend to set up hierarchies in education. And, we have gates that are closed, we have doors that are closed, we set up a lot of rules. I had somebody say to me one time that they wish that we thought of the work we do more as a toolkit than a rule kit. And that kind of stuck in my head.
Interesting, really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting way of thinking that when you think about that educators in this country are responsible for disciplining, hundreds of thousands, millions of kids every year that are in schools, we tend to set ourselves up around rules. We tend to have filters that cause us to see things that cause us to, whether it's in an interview and we pick somebody that's most like us. If you have 6 or 8 teachers around a table, one of the things that I've learned is that they will select what they know rather than sometimes taking a risk on the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found that when I was in business that I wanted someone who thought differently than I did, because my father once said to me, if we're all thinking the same, then no one's thinking. So it's really important, I think, that we bring people to our table in discussions who don't agree with us, because they point out things we might overlook. And I've always found it valuable. Have you found that same thing?
Well, it's really interesting because I think that I've always intuitively known that, but it was when I read a book called The Medici Effect by a young guy out of Harvard Business School. And he really studied what causes teams to have a high level of creativity. And what he found is, and this is interesting, that diverse teams where you have people that are boundary spanners, maybe it's somebody that you put, if it's in a higher education, you put a chemistry professor together with somebody in history, and so they're crossing the boundaries of disciplines or demographics or cultures, that you have a longer period of storming with teams that work like that before they get their creative juice flowing. Mm-hmm. But if you put together a group of people that are really similar, the likelihood that you're going to get the most creative, interesting solutions, ideas, products is diminished greatly by having groups that are more homogenous than diverse.
Can you give me an example when you saw that yourself?
Yeah, I sure can. I think and probably the one that I just mentioned is a good one, because one of the things I've always wanted to do, and as a young elementary principal back in the day where my hair actually had a little more brown in it than gray, I was at one point actually, a brown-haired young administrator, that I realized that one of the things I wanted to do is I really did I had a lot of thinking about, how do you flatten hierarchy? How do you have people feel like, we were a site-based management system, which meant that we had a lot of control at the building level. I always wanted to kind of share some of that leadership. But what I realized is that when I would put people together in the room to interview with me, and we'd bring in maybe 8 applicants for a teaching job, that if one of those people was known to anybody in that room, and as you know, most elementary teachers are female, most likely white,
Yes.
and have a very similar sort of mindset about what they're looking for. And so taking a risk on somebody that perhaps deviated from that norm was really difficult. I had one of the very first kindergarten male teachers in Albemarle County. Maybe there were 2 or 3. It was the hardest thing I ever did to get that group of teachers to really think about that a male could teach kindergarten and actually be empathetic and warm and fun and have that deep capability to kid watch and all the things that we were talking about that were really important at the time. And so we hired him, and I had to push on it some, and they finally said, okay, Pam, let's go there. And I probably, if I had just left it up to them completely, I wanted input. I didn't want them to make the decision, but if I had allowed them to make the decision, we'd have never hired him. And one of the things I can tell you is those kids got experiences that they would have never gotten otherwise. He set up woodworking centers in class, which you can imagine he set up significant block centers.
Wow.
All of a sudden, I saw little boys that oftentimes were struggling with kindergarten are not struggling in that class. And so I think about that. One of the things that I wish I had known early on, and I could give you a number of, sort of early experiences like that. One of the things that I realized is that as a young administrator, I really didn't understand the role that our confirmation biases play in the decisions that we make. And so that's something I wish I knew now, because I think it plays out in the way that we perceive parents that walk into our schools. Or even more importantly for me, one of the things that I wish that I'd known earlier on, and I did have a wonderful special education teacher who taught our entire staff this, but there were several years before we got to this. We were doing a re-envisioning workshop, and you've got special ed background, right?
Yes, I am.
So
Yes.
you'll maybe appreciate this. So we were moving into the period of inclusion in the 90s, and it was a really big deal. Regular ed teachers did not want special ed children in their classrooms.
Heck no.
And we were going through a process of re-envisioning the school, and we had kids that had been pulled out of our school, whether they were learning disabled. We didn't call anybody in Virginia dyslexic at that point in time. It's only recently that we've acknowledged that dyslexia actually exists. We didn't really have any kids that were labeled autism or the spectrum in that period of time. But we had, when the county made the decision that they were going to close these pull-out centers where kids were being bused out of their neighborhood communities and put them back in schools, that happened for us. And one of the things that I learned is that the teachers were very unhappy about this. They did not want, whether it was a child that was developmentally delayed, that even still was going to get services outside of the classroom, but we wanted them to have social experiences inside the classroom. They didn't want the kids there. It could be as a kid,
I remember it well. Yes.
And so one of the things that I realized is that we had a pretty significant issue. And so we were going through a revisioning piece, and I had a special education teacher who was a passionate, fierce champion of inclusion. And she said, we're talking about, that part of our vision is that we're going to have this wonderful elementary school community where everybody is welcome and supported, and that we, want all kids to learn and so forth and so on. And she drew a circle on a white, flip chart at that point before the days of doing this kind of stuff on smart boards. She drew a big circle, and she put a bunch of X's inside the circle, and she put a couple of X's outside. And she said, The X's inside of the circle are the kids that you guys are okay having in class, and the kids on the outside are the ones that you want to exclude. She said, I won't support this vision unless we can agree that all the X's belong inside the circle. Now, we didn't get it all solved that day, but she triggered something that brought that meeting to a standstill, and created some dissonance for people. And one of the things that I realized is that I had spent at that point almost 20 years in a career where people's biases about children that have disabilities, whether it's physical, emotional, cognitive, that their biases about what kids could do. One of the things I learned is that we have a lot of kids that are special education kids. If you give them access to the technologies they need, that whole UDL mindset,
yes, absolutely,
it can show you things that you would never see. And so one of the things I wish I had known is I wish we had had access to more research on neuroscience, how the brain works. I wish we had had the tools that we have today, because I've seen kids, that you'll go in and you'll see, a teacher that's working with reading groups, and, the kids that are learning disabled have this like baby set of books to read, and, kids that are more middle class, or, because it's often, it doesn't always divide by class system, but it often does, that poverty and color really trumps a lot in the disability data. But one of the things that really struck me is that it's when a teacher's willing to take a risk to use a tool to give a kid access to something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to access, that all of a sudden you see that locked inside that kid is something that we never knew was possible. Right. And that is something that I feel like that American educators everywhere really have got to get past their biases around some of the technology pieces. Just because a kid can't read print doesn't mean that kid can't access print given the right tools.
Right. So is that one of the takeaways you think that we should have?
I think it's absolutely a takeaway, is that the more opportunities that we take ourselves as educators to take risks, to learn and apply new technologies, and you see doctors doing it all the time. My husband's a great example of that. My gosh, his level of handicap is huge today, but what it would be like without doctors who have been willing to risk take trying new technologies and moving things to a different level in terms of their own expertise and skill has allowed him to be able to stay in our home far longer than he would have been able to do if he had been in a different generation years ago. And so, look at that. And I think we subtract from kids the opportunities to be able to develop the capabilities to do things that we otherwise would not expect them to be able to do. But if we keep our blinders on, we don't see that. And we don't see the kid performing.
Without a doubt.
And what we see are low test scores. But what we don't see is this is a kid who can handle really high levels of material if you can get it into their heads in a different format than just having a book in front of them.
Totally. Pam, this has been such a great chat with you today. I want to thank you. We've been talking with Pam Moran today, and I really am so grateful for your insights. And I do think that what you have to say is really something that we all need to take to heart.
And Chris, just if I could end, I'd love to say thank you for letting me talk. And if people are interested in this topic, it's embedded in a new book, my first book that's rolling out on August 7th. You can find it anywhere, called Timeless Learning. And we spent a lot of time talking about exactly what we've just done in this chat.
Excellent. That's great. I think that's a great way to push this idea forward, which I think we all need to use as a takeaway. So thank you so much, Pam, for sharing with us. You're quite welcome. We hope all of you will join us again when we talk about I Wish I Knew on DisruptED TV podcast. Thanks for listening.